The Galactic Integration Academy floated in the empty space between three dying stars. And it had stood there for 12 million years without moving an inch. Instructor Vidalin watched the newest group of students walk into the examination hall. And he felt nothing special about them because he had seen this exact scene play out more than 40,000 times before. Humans were the third class from Earth since first contact. And they walked with that nervous energy that all young species carried when they first stepped into the wider galaxy. Vethlam was a Sharadi, a being made of living crystal that shifted colors with his emotions. And right now he glowed a steady blue that meant boredom mixed with professional patience. The examination hall was enormous, stretching out in every direction like an indoor ocean. And each student sat at their own station with a glowing screen floating in front of their face. There were 500 questions on the baseline cognition assessment. And every single species that had ever joined the Concordat of aligned civilizations had taken this exact same test. The questions had no wrong answers because they were not designed to measure intelligence or knowledge. They were designed to map how a mind worked, how it sorted information, how it understood the basic nature of reality itself. Vethlan had administered this test to species with 17 brains and species with none at all, to beings of pure energy and creatures that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously, and every single one of them had fallen into predictable patterns that the Academy had documented over millions of years. The humans would be no different. He thought they were primates from a small rocky world, an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. And statistical models predicted they would become minor agricultural contributors to the Concordat within 3 generations. Nothing special, nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. Elena Vasquez sat in row 7, seat 43, and she stared at her screen with the same focused intensity she had brought to every test she had ever taken in her 23 years of life back on Earth. She had been a graduate student in theoretical physics, and she had spent 3 years working on problems that made her professors nervous because she asked too many questions. Her mother always said that Elena took everything apart, and the problem was she did not always know how to put it back together. But Elena had never seen that as a problem, because how could you understand something if you did not first break it down into its smallest pieces? The first 200 questions were easy enough, asking about spatial relationships and temporal sequences and basic logical operations. Elena answered them quickly, barely pausing to think, because these were the kinds of puzzles she had been solving since childhood. Then she reached question 247. The screen displayed simple text that read, "A container holds an object, and the container is destroyed. So what happens to the object?" Elena read the question 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, and something in her brain began to itch across the hall. Veth Allen monitored the progress of all 300 students, and he noticed that most of them had already moved past question 247 within seconds of seeing it. The human in row 7 had been staring at it for nearly 2 minutes. This was unusual, but not concerning, because some students simply took longer to process certain questions. Veth Allen checked his database and saw that question 247 had been answered by over 4 billion students across 900 species in the history of the Academy. The answers were always variations of the same basic concepts. The object is released. The object falls. The object remains where it was. The object ceases to be contained. 412 documented responses across all of known civilization. Elena began to type, and she did not stop typing for 5 minutes straight. When she finished her answer, Veth Allen felt his crystalline form flicker from blue to a shade of orange that he had not experienced in 6,000 years. She had written, define destroyed and define container and define object, because the Question contains at least 17 unstated assumptions about the nature of spatial relationships and temporal persistence and categorical boundaries. And the answer depends entirely on which ontological framework you want me to use, because I can provide solutions in at least 4 different frameworks if you need them. Vethalan read the answer again. Read it a 3rd time. Then he opened a secure communication channel to the Academy's monitoring division, a department that most instructors did not even know existed. His crystalline fingers trembled as he entered a code that had not been used since before the last Galactic War. A code that was supposed to be theoretical, a code that the Academy had created 12 million years ago. For a situation that had never actually occurred, the code was simple. Potential reality HAZARD, below it he added. Cognitive architecture unclassified and recommend observation protocol, Anayani somewhere in the depths of the Academy, in rooms that existed outside normal space. Beings that had not moved in. Millennia suddenly stirred. Elena finished the rest of her examination without any idea that she had just changed everything. She answered the remaining questions with the same methodical approach she always used, breaking each one down into its component assumptions before providing what she considered to be complete responses. When the test ended, she stood up and stretched her arms above her head and thought about getting lunch, because the Academy cafeteria had surprisingly good coffee for a place that was 12 million years old. She walked out of the examination hall and joined her fellow humans in the corridor, laughing at a joke someone made about the weird questions they had encountered behind her. Vethalan remained frozen at his station, his crystalline form cycling through colors that his species had not experienced in recorded history. He watched her walk away, this unremarkable human female from an unremarkable world, and he understood that the galaxy had just become a much more complicated place. The last time someone had answered question 247 the way she had, they had gone on to reshape the fundamental laws of physics across 3 dimensions. The time before that, the being had accidentally collapsed a small universe into a point of infinite density just by thinking too hard about the nature of consciousness. Vasquez had no idea what she was, but Vethalan knew. And as he submitted his report to beings that existed beyond normal space and time, he found himself feeling something his species rarely experienced. He was afraid. The examination was over, and for the first time in 12 million years, the Academy did not know what would happen next. 3 days after the examination, Elena received a message on her personal communicator telling her to report to Room 7 Null in the administrative wing at exactly 1400 hours. She searched the Academy maps for Room 7 Null but found nothing. And when she asked her human classmates, none of them had ever heard of it either. A Corellian student she had befriended during orientation just shrugged his tentacles and said that the Academy was 12 million years old and probably had rooms that nobody remembered. Building Elena arrived at the administrative wing 5 minutes early because her mother had raised her to be punctual, and she wandered the corridors looking for any sign of Room 7 Nalsh. Was about to give up when a door appeared in a wall that had been completely blank just seconds before. The door had no handle and no markings. But when Elena approached it, the surface rippled like water, and she found herself stepping through into a space that made her brain hurt. The room was made of a material she could not identify, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the dimensions felt wrong in a way she could not quite describe. It was like being inside a box that was somehow bigger on the inside while also being smaller. And Elena had to close her eyes for a moment to stop herself from getting dizzy. When she opened them again, she saw that she was not alone. Instructor Vethalan sat on one side of a table that had definitely not been there a second ago, his crystalline form glowing a pale yellow that Elena had learned meant Careful attention, but it was the two beings beside him that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. One of them was not really a being at all, but rather a controlled gravitational anomaly, a point in space where reality bent inward and created something like a face made of distorted light. The other one was even stranger, appearing to be a three-dimensional shadow cast by something that existed in 4 dimensions, constantly shifting and folding in ways that should have been impossible. Elena had read about beings like these in her academy orientation materials, and she knew that they were among the oldest and most powerful entities in the Concordat. The fact that they were here to speak with a first-year human student about a routine examination was terrifying. She sat down in a chair that materialized beneath her and tried to keep her hands from shaking. Vethlon spoke first, and his translator gave his words a formal tone that felt cold and distant. He said, "You are not in trouble, Cadet Vasquez, and we simply wish to understand your answer to question 247. Elena let out a breath she did not know she had been holding and said, "It was a bad question because it had too many unstated assumptions. The gravitational anomaly pulsed in a way that might have been surprise, or might have been something else entirely. And it said, every species we have ever tested understood the question intuitively, because the examination relies on intuitive responses, and you were not meant to analyze." Elena shrugged and said, "I did not analyze it because I just saw the gaps. And where I come from, we spent about 300 years arguing about whether light was a wave or a particle before we realized we were asking the wrong question entirely." She leaned forward and continued, "Container and object and destroyed are not fundamental categories, because they are just useful approximations. And you wanted to know how my mind works, so that is how it works, because I see the approximations, the shadow being rippled in a way that seemed almost excited." And it said to Vethelin, "Ask her the Varg's question." Vethelin's crystalline form went pale, shifting to a white color that Elena had never seen before. And he said, "That question is reserved for..." The shadow being interrupted him and said, simply, "Ask her." Vethelin hesitated for a long moment before projecting a hologram into the air between them. And what appeared made Elena forget about everything else in the room. It was a mathematical structure unlike anything she had ever seen. Something like a knot made of pure logic that folded through 11 dimensions and wrapped around itself in patterns that seemed to defy every rule she had ever learned. The structure was beautiful and terrible at the same time, and Elena found herself leaning closer to study it. Vethelin asked, "What do you see?" Elena examined the structure for about 4 seconds, letting her eyes trace the pathways and connections. And then she said, "It is broken." The room went very still. Elena continued, "There is a contradiction in the 3rd recursion layer, and the whole structure should collapse in on itself. But someone is forcing it to stay stable somehow. And that must take an incredible amount of energy." She tilted her head and added, "Why would anyone build something like that? Because it is like architectural denial, where you force something impossible to exist anyway." Silence stretched out for what felt like hours. Finally, the shadow being spoke, and its voice carried a weight that pressed against Elena's mind like a physical force. It said, "Cadet Vasquez, you have just described the foundational structure of Concordat law, and the paradox you identified has been known to exactly 17 beings in 12 million years. Because it is the reason our civilization functions, and it is never spoken of." Elena blinked and asked, "Oh, should I not have said?" Thatefeland was already entering something into a device that floated beside him, and Elena could see the words forming in the air. Hazard classification UPGRES. The gravitational anomaly moved closer to Elena, bending the light around her in ways that made her skin tingle, and it asked, "Tell us what else you see." Cadet Vasquez. Elena looked around the room, really looked, and she began to notice things that had been invisible to her before it. Walls were not just absorbing light, but actually containing something, holding back a pressure that wanted to push through into normal space. The table in front of her was not a physical object, but a frozen moment in time. A slice of reality that had been stopped and shaped into furniture, and the three beings in front of her were not entirely present, with parts of them existing in places that Elena could almost perceive, but not quite reach. She said, "You are all afraid of something, and this room is designed to contain it. And I think maybe the thing you are afraid of is me." Shadow Being made a sound that might have been laughter. It said, "Not you specifically, Cadet Vasquez, but what you represent, because in 12 million years of testing every sapient species in the galaxy, we have never encountered a human who could see what you see," Elena asked. "What am I seeing?" And Vethelin answered, "The truth." The interview continued for 6 more hours. And by the end of it, Elena understood that her life would never be the same again. She had passed the test she did not know she was taking. And the prize was knowledge that most beings in the galaxy would never be allowed to possess. The question now was what she would do with it. They told her the truth over the course of 3 days, feeding her information in pieces because they said her mind needed time to adjust to concepts that most beings were never meant to understand. Elena sat in a room that existed somewhere outside of normal space, surrounded by beings older than human civilization, and she listened to the history of the galaxy. The Shadow Being did most of the talking because it had been there at the beginning, and its voice carried the weight of memories that stretched back further than Elena could truly comprehend. The galaxy was old. It explained, much older than humans had ever imagined. The concordat of aligned civilizations was even older, stretching back 12 million years to a time when the first truly intelligent species began to spread among the stars. But before the concordat, there had been another civilization, one that was not talked about in any history book or database that normal citizens could access. They were called the Architects, and they had faced a problem that threatened to destroy everything. The problem was simple to describe, but impossible to solve. Reality was inconsistent, not broken. The Shadow Being explained, and not malfunctioning in any way that could be repaired. The universe simply operated on rules that contradicted each other at fundamental levels, like a building constructed with blueprints that said both that the walls should be 10 feet tall and also that they should be 20 feet tall at the same time. Most species never noticed these contradictions because their minds were not built to perceive them. They lived their lives in comfortable ignorance, accepting the reality they could see without ever questioning whether it was complete. But every few million years, a species would evolve that could see the cracks, and when they did, they would try to resolve the contradictions. This always ended badly. Some species went mad, their entire civilization collapsing as they tried to force reality to make sense. Others accidentally tore holes in the fabric of space and time, creating wounds that took millennia to heal. A few actually managed to resolve some of the contradictions, but in doing so, they created new ones that were even worse. The Architects watched all of this happen, and they decided that something had to be done. Their solution was elegant and terrible at the same time. They built a cage, not around bodies or worlds, but around minds themselves. The baseline cognition assessment that Elena had taken was not just a test to measure intelligence, it was a filter designed to identify the cognitive patterns that allowed beings to perceive the inconsistencies in reality. Any species that joined the concordat had their minds gently pruned, adjusted in ways so subtle that they would never notice. They could still think and create and discover, but they would never be able to see the cracks clearly enough to widen them. It was not mind control. The Shadow Being insisted because the beings were still themselves. In every way that mattered, they simply lost the ability to perceive things that would drive them mad or destroy them. For 12 million years, this system had worked perfectly. Species joined the Concordat and were protected from the truth, living their lives in peace while the architects maintained the cage that kept reality from tearing itself apart. But humans were different, Elena asked how. And Vethelin answered because he had studied humans more closely than any other instructor at the Academy. Human minds were unusually flexible, he explained, adapting and changing in ways that other species rarely did. Most beings thought in patterns that were stable from birth to death. But humans could literally rewire their own brains through experience and learning. This flexibility was supposed to make humans easy to prune, because their minds could adapt to the modifications without any damage. The statistical models predicted that by the third generation of human integration, all humans would be safely contained within the cognitive cage, just like every other species. But Elena had proven the models wrong. Her mind recognized patterns that should have been invisible to her, seeing through the constraints as though they did not exist at all. She was not fighting the cage or trying to escape it, because she simply did not perceive it as a barrier. To her, it was just more information, more data to be analyzed and understood. The shadow being told Elena that in 12 million years they had encountered this phenomenon exactly twice before. Both times the being in question had eventually become an architect, ascending beyond their original form to join the entities that maintained the structure of reality itself. Elena asked what that meant. Becoming an architect, and the gravitational anomaly answered with something that might have been sadness. It meant leaving behind everything you were, becoming something new and strange and powerful beyond comprehension. The two beings who had ascended before were no longer recognizable as the species they had once been. They existed in dimensions that normal beings could not perceive, maintaining the impossible contradictions that held the universe together through sheer force of will. It was not death, but it was not life either. It was something else entirely, something that had no word in any language. Elena knew. She sat in silence for a long time after they finished speaking, trying to process everything she had learned. The galaxy was held together by a cage that most beings could never see. Her mind could see through that cage in ways that only two others had ever managed, and the beings in front of her were afraid of what she might become. Finally, she asked the question that had been building in her mind since the beginning. She asked, "What do you want from me?" The shadow being answered, "We want to understand you, Elena Vasquez, because you may be the most important being to exist in 12 million years, and we need to decide whether you are a threat that must be contained or a hope that we have been waiting for." Elena looked at the ancient beings surrounding her, creatures that had existed since before humans had learned to walk upright. She thought about her family back on Earth, her mother and brother who had no idea that the universe was held together by contradictions and impossible mathematics. She thought about all the humans who never looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there, and she realized that whatever happened next, she could not unknow what she had learned. The truth was inside her now, and it was going to change everything. She said, "I am not a threat." The shadow being rippled and asked, "How can you be certain?" Elena smiled and answered, "Because I do not want to tear anything apart, and I never have, because what I want is to understand, and that is what humans do better than anyone else in the galaxy." They gave Elena 3 options, presenting them with the formal gravity of beings who had been making decisions about the fate of civilizations for longer than humans had existed as a species. The civilizations for longer than humans had existed as a species. First option was cognitive modification. They could prune her architecture like they had done to countless others, adjusting her mind so that she would no longer see the cracks in reality. She would lose something in the process, though they could not say exactly what, because every mind was different and the modifications affected each one in unique ways. but she would be safe, contained within the same comfortable limitations that protected every other citizen of the Concordat. She could continue her studies at the academy, graduate with her class, and live a normal life among the stars. The second option was isolation. There were places in the galaxy where reality hazards were quarantined. Special facilities designed to contain beings whose perceptions were too dangerous to be allowed to spread. Elena would live comfortably in one of these places, with every need provided for and everyone anticipated, but she would never leave. Never interact with other beings who might be affected by her unique way of seeing the universe. She would exist in a bubble of safety, protected from the galaxy and protecting the galaxy from her. The third option was ascensions. She could become what her mind was already shaping her to become. Following the path of the two beings who had come before her, she would join the architects, or what remained of them, scattered across dimensions that they had created to contain their own contradictions. She would gain power beyond human comprehension, the ability to shape reality itself through pure thought. But she would never be human again, never see her family, never experience the simple joys that had made her who she was. The shadow being presented these options without emotion, as though it were reading from a script that had been written millions of years ago. Perhaps it was, Elena thought, because they had done this twice before and probably knew exactly how the conversation would go. He asked for a day to decide, and they granted her request without argument. Elena left the room that existed outside of space and found herself standing in the Academy gardens, surrounded by plants from 1,000 different worlds. The sun that lit the gardens was artificial, a contained star that had been burning at the heart of the Academy since before humanity had discovered fire. She walked along paths made of some material that felt like stone but glowed faintly with inner light, passing students from dozens of species who laughed and argued and complained about homework. A Corellian trader sat on a bench talking into a communicator, complaining about shipping tariffs and delayed cargo. A Mesher poet sat under a tree that had leaves like silver mirrors, composing verses about homesickness and the distance between stars. Two Voldani engineers walked past Elena, arguing loudly about the proper tensile strength of structural alloys, their forearms waving as they made their points. None of them knew the truth. None of them could see the cage that held their minds in comfortable limitation, protecting them from a universe that did not make sense. They were happy in their ignorance, living full lives within boundaries they would never perceive. Elena sat down on a bench and watched them for hours, thinking about the choice she had to make. She thought about her grandmother, who had worked 3 jobs to send Elena to university because she believed that education was the key to a better life. She thought about her little brother Marcus, who was probably playing video games right now on a planet that had no idea what existed in the dark between stars. She thought about her mother, who had always said that Elena asked too many questions, that she took things apart without knowing how to put them back together. Her mother had meant it as criticism, but Elena had always seen it as her greatest strength. Could you understand something if you did not first break it down into its smallest pieces? How could you fix something if you did not first see where it was broken? She thought about all the humans throughout history who had looked at the world and refused to accept the easy answers, the scientists who had questioned everything they were told, the philosophers who had pushed against the boundaries of knowledge, the dreamers who had imagined things that everyone said were impossible. Humanity had never been content to stay within limitations. That was what made them human. Elena stood up as the artificial sun began to set, painting the garden in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of home. She walked back to the room that existed outside of space, and when the door appeared in the blank wall, she stepped through without hesitation. The 3 beings were waiting for her, just as she had known they would. Shadow being asked, "Have you made your decision?" Elena said. there is a fourth option, and you did not mention it. But it exists because I can see it in the way you phrased the choices and in the gaps in what you did. Not saveth lawn flickered to a shade of white that meant alarm. And he said, that option is not available to you. Elena smiled and said, you are lying. Because it is not that it is unavailable, but that you are afraid of it. She continued, I could stay human and stay here and keep learning. And instead of tearing at the cracks, I could learn to mend them. The shadow being went very still, more still than Elena had ever seen it. And it said, that is not possible. Elena shook her head and said, you do not know that because you have never had a human who could see. And you have spent 12 million years containing the problem, because you were afraid to solve it. She spread her hands and said, I am a scientist. And where I come from, we do not just identify contradictions, because we resolve them. And we build theories that hold opposing truths together. And we find synthesis where others see only impossible paradox. The gravitational anomaly pulsed and asked, and if you fail? And if your attempts to resolve the contradictions only widen them instead? Lena thought about Earth and her grandmother's hands worn from work and her brother's laughter and 8 billion people who had no idea how fragile their existence was. She said, then I will contain myself before it is too late. And I promise you that the three beings looked at each other for a long moment, communicating in ways that Elena could almost perceive, but not quite understand. Finally, the shadow being spoke and said, we will be watching every moment and every thought that approaches the boundaries. Lena nodded and said, good. Because I work better with accountability, and just like that, the choice was made. 10 years passed, and Elena Vasquez stood before the Concordat Assembly as the first human ever granted that honor. The assembly chamber was a space that should not have existed, stretching in directions that had no names and containing beings that defied easy description. Around her floated representatives of 40,000 species, creatures of crystal and light and gravity and thought, all of them waiting in a silence that pressed against her mind like deep water. Elena's hair had turned gray now. Even though she was barely 33 years old, the beings who monitored her had explained that this was the cost of perceiving too much, that the mind aged the body when it reached beyond normal boundaries. She did not mind, because the gray in her hair was proof of how far she had come. For 10 years she had studied the cracks in reality, mapping the contradictions that held the universe together with painstaking care. She had worked with mathematicians from species that thought in numbers humans could not pronounce, and philosophers from worlds where logic was a living thing. She had pushed against boundaries that had stood for 12 million years, always careful, always watched, always aware that one wrong step could unravel everything. There had been moments when she almost gave up, when the contradictions seemed too vast and the solutions too far beyond her reach. But Elena had never been able to stop asking questions. And every time she wanted to quit, she remembered what her mother had said about taking things apart. The trick was not to stop taking things apart. The trick was to learn how to put them back together in new ways. Now she stood before the assembly with an answer that had never existed before, a solution to a problem that the oldest beings in the galaxy had considered unsolvable. She raised her hands and began to speak, a voice carrying through dimensions that she had learned to perceive over years of careful study. She said, I have found it. The synthesis, the way to make the contradictions cohere without collapsing. She projected her work into the air around her, and what appeared made the assembly stir with emotions that ranged from disbelief to terror to something that might have been hope. It was mathematics that sang, logic that breathed, frameworks that danced between incompatible truths and held them all in a structure that was not forced but invited. The shape of it was beautiful in ways that Elena had not expected, like watching a flower bloom in multiple dimensions at once. She explained, it is not a cage, it is a conversation. Because reality is not consistent, and it was never supposed to be consistent. The assembly rippled with confusion, and Elena could feel their questions pressing against her mind. She continued, "The universe is growing and evolving, and the contradictions are not flaws but growth points. Places where reality is trying to become something more than it was of being made of pure." Mathematics spoke from somewhere in the crowd and asked, "You are saying the inconsistencies are intentional?" Elena nodded and said, "Not intentional in the sense of being designed by someone, but intentional in the sense of having purpose." She gestured to her projected structure and said, "For 12 million years, you have been containing the inconsistencies to protect yourselves, building cages around minds to keep them from seeing the cracks, but containment was never the answer." Because integration eyes, Vethelin spoke from the front row of the assembly, his crystalline form old now and flickering at the edges with colors that meant wonder and fear combined. He asked, "You are proposing that we teach beings to see the cracks instead of hiding them?" Elena said. "Not just to see them, but to see them as doorways, as opportunities rather than threats." The shadow being that had first interviewed her 10 years ago drifted closer, and its voice carried the weight of 12 million years of doubt. It asked, "And if the doorways lead somewhere we cannot survive?" Elena smiled, the same smile she had worn in that dark room so long ago when she had proposed a fourth option that terrified ancient beings. She said, "Then we learn to survive there, because that is what humans do." She looked out across the assembly at species who had feared her kind for a decade, who had watched her every thought for signs of danger. She said, "We do not just adapt to reality. We expand the definition of reality to include us." She continued, "The universe is bigger than your cages and bigger than your fear. And humanity is going to prove it, not by tearing anything down, but by building something that has never existed before." Assembly was silent for a long moment, and Elena could feel the weight of their attention pressing against her from every direction. Then slowly, one by one, the beings of the Concordat began to move toward her projection, studying the structure she had created, with eyes and senses that spanned every form of perception. In the galaxy, a Corellian trader examined the mathematical foundations and announced that they were sound. A measure philosopher traced the logical pathways and declared them elegant. The being, made of pure mathematics, spent several minutes calculating probabilities before stating that the synthesis had a 73% chance of functioning as intended. That was better odds than any previous attempt had ever achieved. The shadow being floated before Elena and said, "You understand that if this works, everything will change?" Elena said, "I am counting on it." The ancient being made a sound that might have been laughter and said, "Then let us see what humans can truly do." Elena raised her hand and reached into her projection. Touching the structure she had spent 10 years building, the synthesis began to unfold across the galaxy. In minds that had been caged for 12 million years, something new began to stir. It was not freedom exactly, because freedom implied escape from something. This was expansion, the widening of perception to include truths that had always been there but never been seen. Beings who had never questioned reality began to glimpse the cracks, and instead of fear, they felt wonder. The contradictions that had seemed like flaws became doorways, and through those doorways, they could see possibilities that had never existed before. Elena watched it happen, feeling the change ripple outward from the assembly chamber. Through dimensions, she had learned to perceive her mother had been wrong about her all along. Elena did not just take things apart, she took them apart so that she could put them back together better than before. The galaxy held its breath as the synthesis completed, and when it was done, the universe was larger than it had been, not physically larger, but conceptually larger, containing truths that had previously been hidden behind walls of protective ignorance. The cage was gone, replaced by something more beautiful and more dangerous and more Alavevithlon approached Elena as the assembly began to disperse. Beings of every shape and form drifting away to contemplate what had just happened, he said. "You have changed everything," Elena said. "I know," he asked. "Was it worth it?" "Giving up your humanity to achieve this," Elena laughed and said. "I did not give up my humanity. I proved it." She looked out at the vast chamber with its impossible geometry and its beings older than time. She said, "This is what humans do. We see walls and we build doors, we see cages and we find keys. We see contradictions and we find synthesis." The old charade flickered through colors that had no names. And he said, "Then perhaps we were wrong to fear you." Elena smiled and said, "You were not wrong to fear us. You were wrong to think that fear was the only response." She turned to leave the chamber, ready to begin the work of helping the galaxy adapt to its new expanded reality. Behind the shadow being called out, "Where will you go now?" "Elena Vasquez," she answered without looking back. "Forward, always forward. Because that is the only direction humans know how to move." And as she walked through a doorway that had not existed until she created it, Elena thought about her grandmother, and her brother and her mother and all the billions of humans who would never know what she had done for them. They would keep looking up at the stars and wondering what was out there. And now, thanks to her, there was more out there than there had ever been before. The galaxy was not contained anymore. It was growing, and humanity would grow with it.